So you want to fire a steam locomotive, is that right? You want to learn how to fire one. What we're going to do tonight is not the demonstrative type of firing a steam locomotive, but is some things that I'm going to point out to you that is important that you know well before you even get in the cab of a steam locomotive. I believe the most important thing to an engineer on a steam locomotive is safety. Safety for himself and safety for his passengers. We are going to confide this session to safety to you, because you're the engineer. You are near the danger points. I think most of you, correct me if I'm wrong, have been driving the diesel type locomotive, have been engineering diesel types. Okay. Steamer types are an entirely different bag of bees. The reason I say this is that anybody on a steam locomotive can set the brakes. Anybody can pull the throttle. Any child can do that. But it takes real knowledge to be able to operate a boiler. And that is where the safety angle of this comes in. You must learn how to operate a boiler, because once you leave the station, whether you have no passengers or whether you have 30 passengers, you are on your own. You're on your own. You must be able to operate the boiler. You must be able to keep the boiler pressure up. You must be able to keep water pumps working, going all the time. Depending on the type of fuel you're using, you must be sure that your fuel situation is good, and I'll elaborate more on that later. You must be sure that the right-of-way is clear. So when it comes to steam locomotive, you are busy. Believe me, you are busy, especially if you have a heavy load. You only get to glance up at the track every once in a while because you're open and closing valves. You're manipulating valves all the time. A lot of people say to me, look up when we want to take your picture. Well, you can't look up and look down too. It's pretty hard to do because you are looking at your valves. Okay. The first order of safety, of course, as I said, is to yourself. So therefore, don't ever try to operate a steam locomotive, no matter what kind of fuel you use, unless you have a glove on, at least one glove. Some of these valves get awfully hot, and I mean they can get good and hot. A steam locomotive does not function well unless it is hot all over, hot even to the wheels on the valves. Therefore, these hot steam valves must be handled with gloves. Even your whistle valve handle will get hot. So wear a glove. Don't attempt, please, to operate a steam locomotive unless you have at least one glove on. Preferably two. You may have hot steam valves across the whole cab, which means you may have to have two gloves on. And you say, gee whiz, Mr. Cassady, I can't do things with gloves on. Once you get used to it, you'll see how easy it is. Okay. That is the first order in operating a steam locomotive. Wear at least one glove, preferably two. The second most important factor is proper control of your fuels. Now, I am not going to get into what kind of fuel should you use. This is your option. If you are building a locomotive, if you are operating, if your dad is making a locomotive, the selection of fuel is ordinarily taken out of our hands. We have no choice. There's the locomotive, it's got propane in it, so we're going to run propane. I'm not going to sit here and say propane is the best. I'm not going to say coal is best. I'm not going to say corn shucks are best. This is up to you. Whatever fuel you use, you will learn to use, and you will learn to use it well. So let's not get into what kind of fuel to use, but remember that fuel, when it's burning in the firebox, is hot. This is a danger point. So here again is this second most important thing. If you have the opportunity of getting on somebody's steam locomotive to operate it, the second most important thing for you to know is not where the throttle is, not where the brake is, but show me where I put the water into the boiler. Which valves do I open or close to operate the pumps, to operate the injector, or other means of putting water into the boiler. Let me digress here for a minute. I have seen many locomotives, steam locomotives, built by fellas who are good machinists and do immaculate work, and they put the locomotives on the track, and they come up and they get the fire going, and then they can't get enough water into the boiler to keep it operating. They got to stop because the water keeps going down in the water column. And you all know what I mean by a water column? That is the gauge in there that shows how much water you got in your boiler. So the second most important thing in the way of operating a steam boiler is where are the valves for putting water into the boiler? And how do I put water into the boiler? You must know this. There's all kinds of actions to get water into a boiler. There's the hand pump. It could be on the side of the locomotive. It could be on the tender. That is one that you work by hand. There is a steam-driven feed pump, a water feed pump. These little pumps that you see outside that are going up and down like this, these are driven by steam and are pumping water into the boiler. There's axle pumps that you can't see that are underneath between the wheels. And it's just moving in and out, back and forth with every revolution of the drive wheels. And it's pumping water only when the engine is moving, however. Excuse me, there is the injector type feed water system where you open up a water valve and then shoot steam into it, and the steam and the water are expanded and push themselves into the boiler over and above boiler pressure. Then of course there is on older engines, on the old time engines, some of the American type engines had the crosshead pumps, which operated very similar to the axle pump, but were visible because they're on the crossheads. So in your safety and in an operation of a steam locomotive, you must know how to get water to the boiler. If you are unable to get water into the boiler at a fast enough pace, if you're using steam faster than what you are putting water into it, your water will start to go down in the water column, and the first thing you know, it is out of sight and you're low on water. Then you get panicky. And I don't blame you at all for getting panicky, because I've suffered this myself. Because you visualize that the water is now going below your flues and you're running out of water. You visualize your crown sheet, and I won't get into it, but that's the top of the firebox is beginning to warp. And if that begins to warp, you're beginning to get into trouble. I have seen flues in these little locomotives go into like spaghetti where they get so hot. So it is good to get panicky, but not to the point where you don't think properly. The best thing for you to do in this case is to scrub your fire. If it's coal fire, haul the ash, haul the coal out right on the deck or on the ground. with the little hoe or poker or by any means. Get rid of your fire. If it's propane, turn your fire off. If it's oil, turn your fire off. Try to get all your pumps working, at least some of them, to get that water up. It is my recommendation for beginners, and I told Tom Hill this, because I did it when I first began to run a steam locomotive, and I found it invaluable, is to have a pump by hand on the tender. If your pumps fail, and they do fail, especially to novice people who don't know how to repair them, or to fellows who have a brand new pump and then put it on and the pump will run for 2 or 3 weeks and then always quit at the worst time, you still have insurance by your side. So if your pumps do fail, you can get off and you can start pumping by hand and get water to the boiler. Yes, it's tough, Stephen. It is tough, really, because you're pumping against pressure, see? Now the pressure could drop off to 100 pounds, but it's still pretty tough to work that pump. But it is insurance that you're going to save the boiler. You don't want that boiler blowing up. This is what I'm talking about in safety. That boiler is under your care. And on some tracks, here we're blessed where everything is in sight pretty well. And if a fella gets into trouble, there's a lot of people around that can come to his aid. On some tracks, a guy could be in trouble and nobody would ever know it until there's steam coming out of the boiler and it's beginning to get so hot that steam is leaking out, and then the pressure is reduced and it's out of trouble anyway, but the boiler is ruined. So there's 2 things to remember. First of all, number 1, the glove. That's important. Protect your hands. Number 2, know how to get water into the boiler. Now the third thing is how to fire your boiler. From a safety viewpoint, there is not any real danger in firing a boiler, assuming that you know how to get water to it and that you got gloves on. If it's a coal-fired job, no matter what fuel you use, no matter what fuel you, if you're not used to handling a certain type of fuel, you might feel a little apprehensive. For instance, if Edison Yoder said, "John, take my engine, put some cars behind it, go out and run it," I'd say, "Okay, show me how to operate a propane burner." I'm not a propane man. So listen to the master, to the owner. He'll tell you how to operate the propane burner or the oil burner or how to fire the coal. Listen to him, see? And then if he says, "Okay, take it," you make sure that the owner of that locomotive is sitting behind you, because you could lose your fire, you could puff it out through the stack, you could do some of your valving wrong and your fire would go out. Even on a coal fire, fires go out in coal fire jobs. They actually do go out because you don't know when to shake the ashes, you don't know when to get in there with a poker, and you don't know when to fire, or you don't know how to operate the blower. So you must get instruction from somebody. Please don't do it the way I did it. I had nobody to show me, and it took me a year to learn how to fire my boiler properly under all conditions. And that's something else we'll get to. What time is it, Tommy? I don't want to take up too much time. 7:35. Okay, so if your dad has built the steam locomotive, or somebody has asked you to run their steam locomotive, you listen, ask for instructions first. Everybody does that. Be sure and ask for instructions. Not about how to put the gloves on. Anybody can do that. But how to operate the pumps. Where's the valves for the pumps? And tuck it away up here real good. If you don't understand, ask. If you don't understand, ask again, because it's important. Then he will show you how to fire, whether it be coal, oil, propane, or corn, or whatever, wood chips, or whatever. Then get him on behind you and take the engine out slow. And I mean slow. If you probably only have 1 or 2 cars on, but run it slow. You don't have to look at the track so much unless you're at a meet and there's a whole mess of cars, or engines. But ordinarily, if you're by yourself, and that's the time to learn how to run, take it out and run it slow. Watch your pressure. There's 2 things to watch: your pressure gauge, and also watch the water column. Now, if you're running your pumps too fast, you may have to shut your water off, because you get too much water. Too much water in a boiler means that you're going to have water coming out the stack, and if it's a coal burner, you're going to look like a speckled hen because you got black polka dots all over you. If you're an oil burner, you're going to get water all down through you, and if you're a propane burner, you're going to get water too. So, and in an oil burner, you're going to lose your fire if you got too much water, because the water will go down through your burner and choke off the flame just like that. But it takes practice, kids, no matter what fuel you are using. Now, I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on it, but don't expect to get on a steam locomotive and be able to run it right off the bat, even though your teacher was the best in the world. In my experience, I have seen this happen a lot of times, and it will happen to you. A fella's made a steam locomotive, and he's got 200-300 feet around his house, and he's got 2 cars, and he gets on it, and he runs around the house, and then the old steam gauge is up here at 120 pounds, and the water is just right, and he's going along, he's doing it real good, see? So he comes to a track like here, a bigger track, or like the one at my house, and he'll say, "Hey Tom, how about putting on some cars behind me? Can I borrow some cars?" "Sure, Joe." "Okay." So Tom puts on 8 or 10 cars behind me, plus the 2 that he has. So he's got a nice long train, and he got his fire going real well, and about 8 or 10 people get in the cars, and he opens up the throttle, and he pulls out down around through here, and he gets over by the fence here, and he comes to a stop. And he'll say, "I don't understand it." "What's the matter, Joe?" "My pressure's dropped to 60. I don't know what's going on. It never happened to me before." So he'll sit there, and if it's a coal burner, he'll shuffle it in and turn his blower up. Or if it's an oil burner, he'll turn his fire way up. Or a propane, he'll turn his fire up. That needle will get up to 120. Then he backs his fire down, gets everything all set, and away he goes. He comes back here, and his pressure's down to 50. I don't understand it. Well, this has happened to me when I was learning to run a locomotive so much, and it's really quite simple. I made a remark about 5 minutes ago that it took me a year to learn how to run my steam locomotive under all conditions. Now, by all conditions, this includes track conditions. What kind of radiuses or curves are we going around? What kind of grades are we taking? How much of a load have I got behind me? I knew I was going to give this clinic this evening, and this afternoon I had a good example of what could happen if you didn't practice enough. The group that was out was about 50 people. Most of them were adults. The kids were all riding first, so usually I'd leave and I'd have about 15 kids on board. Some of them were little ones, and some of them in elementary school, primary school. Average age about 9 years old. No big deal, no big load. So after I rode them a couple of times, I came back into the station. All the parents decided to get on, and some of these guys, I mean to tell you, Henry, they were monsters, see. They could barely get into the cars, see. So instead of having 15 kids, I had about 14 guys that weighed, I don't know, average 180 pounds. And I look back, so the first thing I did is turn my fire up. I mean, I really turned up. I knew I was going to use a lot of water. I knew I was going to use a lot of steam. This comes with experience, and it comes with practice. So you turn your fire up, you turn your pumps up, because you're going to use a lot of steam. If you use a lot of steam, you need more water going into your boilers, so you have to turn your pumps up faster. In order to keep that needle sitting at 120 pounds, you must be able to distinguish. Usually you can distinguish before you've gone 10 or 20 feet. You can tell the way your load responds to the engines, to the wheels turning. And this takes practice. You can't do it in a matter of a month or 2 months. Because sometimes if you got 2 cars on, you may be going down the track and it's popping off and blowing off. You got too much fire, and you're just wasting energy, and you've got to run your pumps real fast because so much of the energy is going out the pop valve. And there's nothing more disgusting to me than to hear a pop valve blowing all the time, because it's irritating to the ears, and people talking to you can't hear, and it's a waste of energy. And on top of that, in cold weather, it gets you all wet sometimes. Anyway, don't, just because you couldn't do it the first time, or the first week, or the second week, kids, stick with it. It takes practice. It takes practice. Don't practice with 1 or 2 cars only. Put on more cars. Get used to the loads. Ask people to ride with you. Do what I did. If you don't get the people, go out and give some of the guys concrete blocks next door. Fill the cars up with concrete block. It makes good practice. It weighs a lot. This is what makes a good engineer, being able to meet all criteria when it comes to the operation of your engine. I think that's enough, Henry, because we're getting a little late. I know Bill Whitman wants to put on his program, but I would like to continue this because there's a lot more to steam. This has just been talk. See, we should have a demonstration sometime.
Okay, good. John, I'd like to thank you for coming out and being with the kids here tonight. I'm sure they appreciate it. Now, I'd like to add just one thing. I have visited John at his house one time. We had a very interesting visit. Every word that he's saying to you is true. We got his engine out after having a nice meal. We got his engine out, and he sat down and he took quite a bit of time with me and showed me how to work, where the controls were, what did what. And I ran his engine we pulled a train for probably an hour and a half, 2 hours. I don't remember. It was a long time, but it wasn't really long enough for me. And I learned a lot. But I didn't have any people on that train to add a load. So if I ever run that engine with a load, it's going to be a different story altogether. Today, I ran a steam engine out here. The controls on that engine were entirely different. There were controls to do the same things, but they were in different places. So just like most of you run your diesels, we all run all the diesels, and when we put them all together, they ran entirely different from when they were running separately. We had a heavier load behind them, everything like this. So things are similar, but there are a lot of differences. There's a lot more to running a steam engine. Because the diesels, you push the switch, you open the throttle, and it runs. You don't have to worry about the fire, you don't have to worry about the water. And you have a master teaching you. He's going to continue.
Let me tell you something about Henry. I've never said this about anybody else, but I did tell his dad this, so I can tell you. Maybe his dad did tell you. Henry is the only fella that has been on my locomotive that I showed how to operate it once. I just showed him, told him where everything was, and then I got behind him and he got on the locomotive and he took off, and I never had to say another word to him. And this amazed me because I've been running steam locomotives for 6, 8, 10 years, and I've never known a guy like this. So I was telling Tom Hill this. I said, does Henry have a photographic memory that he could memorize all of that? He says, I think he does. Now, I don't know whether he'd admit it or not, but he is the only guy, and Lord knows I've had hundreds of guys on my locomotive, and I've never known anybody to respond like you.
Thank you.
So do you have a photographic memory?
I don't, I guess if it's something I want to remember, I do. I guess that's like most of us.
See, I think there's 14 or 15 valves in my cab. And they're all little valves. I'm not including the brake valve and the cylinder cock valves. I'm not including any of that. These are operational valves to keep you going. And he remembered where they were. Anyway, let's continue this discussion, and we'll have we'll get into it deeper. This is mostly along the lines of safety and what you have to do in order to make a good engineer and keep your locomotive going. Okay?
Thank you, John. Appreciate it very much.
We're not, Tom, we should continue with this at another meeting. Okay?